There is a truth that runs deeper than the surface of our everyday existence. It whispers quietly when we are alone, when the noise of the world fades, and the ache of our hearts becomes undeniable. It is the truth that suffering is not only an event, but often a cycle, a wheel that turns and turns, repeating patterns of hurt, disappointment, and loss, until we feel entrapped by forces we cannot explain. Many of us live not once, but countless times through the same heartbreak, the same betrayal, the same fear. We ask ourselves, why does this keep happening to me? Why do I always end up in this same place? And yet, behind this cycle lies a spiritual principle, one so simple, yet so profound, that when we embrace it, the repetition begins to dissolve. The shadows of pain loosen their grip, and life opens into something freer, fuller, more whole. Tonight, I want to share with you 5 dimensions of this principle, 5 revelations that not only explain why emotional pain recurs, but also reveal how to break free from it. Pain is never erased by denial, it is only displaced. What we push away from consciousness does not dissolve into nothingness. It sinks into the hidden chambers of the soul, gathering strength, waiting for a moment to resurface. It becomes a ghost that follows us, shaping our choices, coloring our perceptions, haunting our relationships, and often returning with even greater intensity when we least expect it. Many of us live believing we have outrun our sorrow, when in truth we have only buried it alive. And what is buried alive demands resurrection. So often we see this pattern play out in quiet, almost invisible ways. A person loses someone dear, yet refuses to grieve. They wear strength as a mask, convincing themselves they are fine, because to admit otherwise feels too vulnerable. They fill their days with work, achievements, endless motion, never stopping long enough to hear the quiet sob beneath the surface. Years later, when they enter a relationship, they find themselves plagued by an irrational fear of abandonment. Every delay in a text message, every pause in affection, feels like rejection. The partner becomes confused, not realizing that they are being asked to carry the weight of a grief that has never been spoken. What was denied did not disappear, it simply transformed into a new kind of suffering. The truth is unyielding. What we reject in ourselves returns through the world around us. If we bury grief, it emerges as anxiety. If we deny anger, it becomes bitterness. If we suppress loneliness, it manifests as attachment to those who cannot truly love us. Life is a mirror, reflecting back the wounds we have not dared to confront. Until we face them, we remain trapped in cycles of repetition, mistaking fate for misfortune, when in fact it is our own unacknowledged soul that is calling out for recognition. Consider the person who suffers betrayal in love, but refuses to process the pain. They tell themselves it does not matter, that they will move on quickly, that they are stronger than their wound. But rather than heal, they carry suspicion into every new relationship. They demand constant reassurance, misinterpret kindness as manipulation, and live in fear that the past will repeat itself. In truth, it is not the betrayal itself that imprisons them, but the refusal to truly face it. The denial of pain does not spare us from it. It multiplies it because it demands expression in disguised and distorted forms. There is a profound principle hidden here. That which is suppressed rules us. A person who cannot acknowledge their anger may think of themselves as peaceful, but in reality, their anger controls them by erupting in sudden explosions, or by quietly poisoning their relationships with resentment. A person who hides their sadness may appear strong, but in truth, the sadness guides their every step, shaping decisions from the shadows. The pain we will not face becomes the unseen master of our destiny. And yet there is another truth, one that offers hope. The very act of turning toward our pain loosens its grip. What we bring into the light begins to lose its power over us. To sit with sorrow, to allow ourselves to weep, to say aloud, "I am hurt, I am lonely, I am afraid," this is not weakness. It is the beginning of liberation, for when the wound is acknowledged, it no longer needs to speak through disguise. It is seen, it is heard, it is given space, and in that space it begins to heal. Think of the child who falls and scrapes their knee. If they hide it, pretend nothing happened, the wound festers. But when the wound is cleaned and exposed to air, it heals naturally. So too with the soul. Unspoken grief, unacknowledged shame, hidden rage, these fester when concealed. But when we allow them into the open air of consciousness, they begin to transform. The simple act of admitting, "Yes, I hurt," is already a movement toward wholeness. There is immense courage in such honesty, because it requires us to drop the armor we have worn for so long. The world teaches us to hide our wounds, to perform strength, to believe that vulnerability is a flaw. But the deeper truth is that only by embracing our vulnerability do we find real strength. Tears are not evidence of weakness. They are evidence that the heart is still alive. Anger, when acknowledged, can be redirected into clarity and boundary. Fear, when faced, can teach us resilience. The emotions we fear are not enemies but guides, pointing us toward what still needs healing within us. I recall a man who had spent his entire life running from the grief of losing his brother in childhood. He became successful, wealthy, admired, yet he lived with a hollow ache he could not name. In every friendship he kept distance. In every triumph he felt no joy. Only when he finally allowed himself to sit in silence, to remember, to cry, to tell his story without shame, did something shift. The grief did not vanish, but it softened. It became integrated into his life as love, as memory, as meaning. For the first time he felt whole. This is the paradox of healing. The very thing we most fear facing is the doorway to our freedom. We imagine that if we open the wound, it will destroy us, but in truth, it is keeping the wound closed that destroys us, for it consumes us from within. To face it is to allow life to flow again. It is like a dam breaking. The water that was stagnant begins to move, cleansing, renewing, restoring. We must learn to speak with our wounds as though they are living presences within us, because in a sense they are. They are younger versions of ourselves, frozen in time, waiting to be acknowledged. The child who felt abandoned, the teenager who felt unseen, the adult who felt betrayed, they live within us still, asking not for rejection but for compassion. When we deny them, they grow louder. When we embrace them, they begin to rest. Freedom, then, is not found in pretending we are unbroken. It is found in courageously saying, "Yes, I am wounded, and yet I am still here. Yes, I carry pain, and yet I can face it." For when we allow the wound to speak, it no longer rules our life in secret. The energy that was bound up in suppression becomes available for creativity, for love, for living fully. What once enslaved us becomes, paradoxically, the source of our strength. Thus, the path to liberation is not escape, but confrontation. Not denial, but acknowledgement, not rejection, but integration. The moment we stop running from pain and turn toward it, something miraculous occurs. The cycle begins to break. What once returned again and again in the form of fear, conflict, and disappointment now transforms into wisdom, resilience, and compassion. The wound becomes the teacher, and the scar, instead of a mark of shame, becomes a mark of survival and depth. And so the question is not whether we will experience pain, for all human life carries it, but whether we will face it or flee from it. To face it is to free ourselves. To flee from it is to remain bound. Every moment we choose honesty over denial, compassion over rejection, courage over fear, we move closer to wholeness, and in wholeness the ghosts of the past no longer need to chase us, because they have finally found a home within us. Life has a rhythm that does not bend to our will, but instead follows its own deeper intelligence. We often misinterpret this rhythm as cruelty, as if some unseen hand is determined to keep us trapped in the same disappointments, the same heartbreaks, the same failures. Yet, what feels like punishment is in truth persistence. Life insists upon our growth. It refuses to let us escape the very lessons we need in order to become whole. And so, the same pattern comes back to us, wearing a different face, playing out in a slightly altered scene, but always echoing the same essential theme. It is easy to call this bad luck, to say we are cursed, or that destiny has conspired against us. But if we look more closely, we find that it is not the world that conspires, but the unconscious within us that repeats. What is unresolved seeks resolution. What is unlearned demands another chance to be learned. The wound unhealed cries out again and again until we turn toward it and listen. In this way, life becomes a mirror not of what we consciously want, but of what we unconsciously need. Take the example of the one who continually finds themselves in relationships where they are not valued. The names change, the personalities shift, the circumstances differ, but the underlying experience remains eerily familiar. Each partner fails to recognize their worth. Each love story ends with the same bitter taste of neglect or betrayal. On the surface, it appears to be coincidence, but beneath it is the psyche's way of saying, until you know your value, until you stand firmly in it, you will be drawn to those who reflect your own doubt back to you. The pattern is not here to punish you, it is here to awaken you. We see this too in people who constantly sabotage their own opportunities. A man dreams of success, yet somehow always fails at the last step. A woman longs for stability, but finds herself repeating cycles of chaos and instability. It is as though some invisible thread pulls them back to the same point, refusing to let them advance. But if we look deeply, we notice that the cycle is carrying a hidden message. Perhaps the man has not faced his fear of responsibility, and so success always escapes him until he confronts it. Perhaps the woman clings unconsciously to her old chaos because it feels familiar, even if painful. The lesson she has not yet learned is that peace can feel safe, that she does not need to recreate the turbulence of her past. In these repetitions, we encounter the paradox of suffering, that it is both painful and purposeful. Emotional pain is not meaningless, it is instructive. Each repeated wound is a teacher disguised as misfortune. Every time the same pattern arises, it is a sign that we have not yet integrated something vital into our being. Life will not allow us to bypass these inner tasks. Just as a child cannot skip essential steps in learning to walk, the soul cannot skip the lessons required for its growth. And so, the cycle returns insistent until the truth is seen. Imagine for a moment that life is like a classroom. If you do not pass the exam, you cannot move to the next level. You are asked to sit with the same material until you finally grasp it. No matter how many times you try to escape, the curriculum does not change. It greets you again and again, not out of cruelty but out of necessity, because without this knowledge you cannot progress. Emotional cycles work in the same way. They are the soul's curriculum, repeating until we understand the lesson hidden within. I recall a woman who had endured 3 marriages, each ending in the same way. She was constantly left feeling invisible, unappreciated, discarded. She began to believe she was cursed, that she was doomed to be unloved. But when she looked more deeply, she realized she had never truly believed she deserved love in the first place. She had grown up in a home where affection was withheld, where silence was the language of care. Without realizing it, she had learned to equate neglect with love, and so she gravitated again and again toward those who repeated the same pattern. Only when she confronted this truth, only when she chose to see her own worth and no longer accept neglect, did the cycle finally break. It was not fate that had doomed her, but an inner wound demanding recognition. When she learned the lesson, life shifted, new patterns emerged, and for the first time she experienced a love that honored her. This is the essence of cycles. They are mirrors held up to us, reflecting the parts of ourselves we have not yet faced. If we ignore the mirror, it appears again, perhaps larger, perhaps clearer. If we shatter it in anger, it reappears in another form. But if we dare to look into it, truly look with honesty and humility, then we begin to see the hidden self it reveals. The cycle does not exist to torment us. It exists to lead us to self-discovery. It requires great courage to recognize the role we play in our own suffering. It is easier to cast ourselves as victims of chance, to say that others have failed us, that the world is unjust. And indeed, others may wound us, and the world is not always kind. But the repetition of the wound signals that something within us is still unfinished. It asks us to stop running outward and instead turn inward, to ask, what is this teaching me about myself? What is it that I have not yet learned? Is it patience? Is it self-respect? Is it the courage to speak my truth? When we begin to ask these questions sincerely, something changes. The cycle loses its grip. We start to recognize the pattern not as destiny but as guidance. We see that life is not punishing us. It is shaping us, molding us into greater wholeness. And once the lesson is integrated, the pattern dissolves. We no longer attract the same experiences because we no longer need them. In this way, our deepest pains can become the source of our greatest transformation. The repeated heartbreak teaches us the value of self-love. The repeated failures teach us perseverance and humility. The repeated betrayals teach us discernment and the importance of boundaries. Each cycle, when understood, gives birth to a new strength, a new capacity for life. We may wish for growth to come gently, through ease and comfort, but often it comes through repetition and difficulty. Life insists because it cares. It insists because it knows that without facing the lessons of our soul, we remain fragmented, half awake, repeating the same mistakes without ever understanding why. When we finally learn, we see that the cycle was not a prison but a teacher, not cruelty but compassion in disguise. And so, the question is not whether the cycle will come, it surely will. The question is whether we will allow ourselves to hear its message. If we resist, it returns. If we embrace, it releases us. In this way, every repeated pain holds within it a quiet invitation to wake up, to see more clearly, to grow more deeply. The moment we accept that invitation, the moment we learn the lesson, the pattern breaks and life opens before us with new possibilities we never imagined. Blame is a drug to the wounded heart. It feels intoxicating to say, "They did this to me. They are the reason for my pain. If only they had acted differently, my life would not be what it is today." In the short term, blame provides relief because it shifts the weight off our own shoulders and places it squarely on another. We feel, for a moment, a sense of clarity, a target for our rage, an explanation for our grief. Yet over time, blame corrodes us. It drains our vitality because it leaves us waiting for an apology that may never come, for a recognition that may never be given, for a justice that may never arrive. It binds our healing to the actions of others, and in doing so, we surrender the very freedom we long for. It is undeniable that others may have wronged us. Life is not without cruelty. People betray trust, parents fail to nurture, partners abandon, friends deceive. There is no denying that pain can be inflicted from outside ourselves. To acknowledge this is necessary. To deny it would be to silence our experience. But the danger lies in remaining there, stuck in the endless narration of what they did, repeating the story as though its retelling could undo it. The truth is that no amount of recounting can change the past. The betrayal occurred, the wound was made. Healing begins not when we rehash their actions, but when we turn inward and ask, "What will I do with this now?" Responsibility does not mean excusing the harm done to us. It does not mean pretending injustice was fair, or betrayal was acceptable, or cruelty was deserved. It means recognizing that, despite what was inflicted, our life is still in our hands. We cannot control what was done, but we can control how it shapes us. This is the turning point where victims become survivors, and survivors become creators of new destinies. I once spoke with a woman who had spent years saying her ex-husband destroyed her life. She could list, in detail, every cruel word, every abandonment, every betrayal, and she was not wrong. He had wronged her deeply. Yet in carrying that narrative like a banner, she lived imprisoned by him still. Though he was no longer in her home, he occupied her mind, her heart, her sense of self. Only when she asked herself, "What in me believed I deserved this treatment? Why did I stay silent when my soul was screaming? Why did I trade dignity for security?" Only then did she begin to reclaim her life. These questions were not about excusing his behavior. They were about liberating herself from the chains she had unknowingly fastened around her own spirit. This is the paradox of responsibility. It feels, at first, like a burden, but it is in truth the key to freedom. Blame says, "I am powerless until they change." Responsibility says, "I have the power to change myself regardless of what they do." Blame keeps the wound raw because it points endlessly outward. Responsibility begins to close the wound because it turns the gaze inward, where transformation is possible. The shift is subtle yet monumental. When we remain in blame, we circle endlessly around the past, rehearsing the same arguments, replaying the same scenes, waiting for the other to acknowledge their role. It is like scratching at a scabbard, never allows healing to take place. But when we move toward responsibility, the energy that was trapped in rage and bitterness becomes fuel for growth. It becomes the strength to set boundaries, the courage to choose differently, the wisdom to recognize red flags, the compassion to break cycles that might otherwise have been passed on to another generation. Consider the child of neglectful parents. It is easy and natural to carry bitterness into adulthood, to point to the lack of love, the lack of care, the wounds inflicted by absence, and such bitterness is understandable. But if the adult clings only to blame, they risk living forever as a child of neglect, still waiting for parents who will never arrive. If, however, they embrace responsibility, they begin to say, "I will give myself the love that was denied. I will learn how to nurture the child in me that my parents could not. I cannot change their absence, but I can change the way I live with it." In that moment, the cycle begins to shift. What once was a story of abandonment becomes a story of resilience. The journey from blame to responsibility is not comfortable, for it asks us to look at ourselves with honesty. It is far easier to say, "They ruined me," than to ask, "Why did I let myself remain in a place that diminished me?" Yet without these questions we remain stuck. With them we begin to see our own agency, not in what happened to us, but in how we respond. Healing requires the courage to admit that while others may have wounded us, only we can choose whether those wounds will define us. This choice is not made once, but daily. Each day we are tempted to fall back into old narratives, to rehearse the story of our pain. And each day we must decide again, will I live as a victim of what was done, or as an author of what can be? This daily act of choosing responsibility strengthens us, much like exercising a muscle. Over time, the story changes. The one who was once defined by betrayal becomes defined by resilience. The one who was once shaped by neglect becomes shaped by the love they learned to cultivate within. It is important to remember that responsibility is not about isolating ourselves in shame. It is not about saying, "It was my fault." Responsibility is never about fault. It is about freedom. It is about claiming the truth that although we cannot alter the past, we can shape the future. The moment we stop waiting for an apology, the moment we stop believing that healing depends on another's change, we open the possibility for a new beginning. There is a story of a man who carried hatred for his father his entire life. His father had abandoned him as a boy, leaving scars of rejection that lingered for decades. Every success, every relationship, every choice was colored by that wound. He blamed his father until the day he realized that his father had long since moved on with his life, untouched by the son's bitterness. It was he, not his father, who remained imprisoned. When he chose responsibility, he said, "My father may have abandoned me, but I will not abandon myself. I will become the father I never had to my own children. I will become the man I needed when I was young." In that moment, the power shifted. No longer was he chained to the absence of another. He became free. So it is with all of us. To remain in blame is to chain ourselves to the actions of others, perhaps forever. To step into responsibility is to reclaim our life, to say, "What was done may shape me, but it will not define me. I choose what I will do with it." That choice, though it requires courage, transforms wounds into wisdom and suffering into strength. There is an instinct in the human heart that seeks to flee from pain. When sorrow comes, we want to turn away, to bury it, to numb it, to escape into any distraction that promises temporary relief. Some escape through work, drowning themselves in endless busyness, so that they need never hear the cry of their own soul. Others escape through substances, silencing the ache with intoxication. Still others escape by wearing masks of laughter, pretending they are untouched, convincing even themselves that nothing has truly pierced them. Yet none of these escapes offer liberation. They may numb the sting for a time, but beneath the surface the wound festers and the cycle continues, returning with greater force, demanding attention, for pain that is not transformed must be repeated. The only true way through pain is not escape, but meaning. Pain, like all of life, demands to be understood. When it remains meaningless, it feels unbearable, absurd, cruel. But when it is given meaning, when it is seen not as mere affliction but as teacher, not as punishment but as possibility, it begins to transform. It ceases to be a cycle of torment and becomes instead a doorway to growth. We see this most profoundly in the testimony of those who have endured the unendurable. Viktor Frankl, imprisoned in the nightmare of a concentration camp, observed that survival was not reserved for the strongest bodies, but for those who could find meaning in their suffering. Amid starvation, cold, and despair, those who could say to themselves, "This suffering is shaping me. This suffering can be redeemed," those were the ones who endured. Frankl himself discovered that by holding onto a vision of his future, by imagining himself speaking to others about the very suffering he was enduring, he could rise above the immediate horror. His pain became not meaningless cruelty, but a source of purpose. In this way, he turned agony into strength, despair into hope, and what is true in the extremes of history is also true in the intimate moments of our own lives. Each of us knows heartbreak, failure, loss, fear. The temptation is to flee from them, to distract ourselves until they fade. But the invitation is deeper, to ask, what is this teaching me? What is this shaping me to become? Heartbreak can teach us empathy, softening us so that we may walk gently with the sorrow of others. Failure can teach us resilience, reminding us that our worth is not bound to perfection but to persistence. Loss can teach us to cherish the fleeting, to treasure each breath, each glance, each day. Fear can teach us courage, showing us that bravery is not the absence of trembling, but the choice to move forward in spite of it. A man who loses his job may fall into despair, believing his identity was only in what he produced. But if he listens to the deeper call, he may discover that the loss is an invitation to rediscover his true passion, to live not for approval but for authenticity. In this way, what seemed like failure becomes liberation. A woman who suffers betrayal may be tempted to close her heart forever. Yet if she dares to search for meaning, she may find that the betrayal was the harsh teacher that led her to honor her own worth, to no longer settle for love that diminishes. The pain then becomes not a prison, but a threshold into a truer self. Meaning does not erase suffering, but it redeems it. It gives it a place in the story of our lives. Without meaning, pain is a heavy stone we drag endlessly, each step a burden. With meaning, the stone becomes the foundation of something new. It becomes the ground upon which wisdom, compassion, and depth are built. Consider the parent who loses a child. There is no escape from such agony. It would be impossible to pretend the loss is not real. Yet many who have endured this have chosen to give meaning to their grief, by creating foundations, by helping other grieving parents, by turning their own sorrow into a light that softens the darkness for others. Their child's death remains a wound, but the wound becomes a source of service, of connection, of love that transcends even death. In this way, the pain fulfills its purpose, and the cycle is broken. The mistake we so often make is believing that the absence of pain is the goal of life. But life is not designed to spare us from all suffering. To be alive is to be vulnerable to loss, to change, to mortality itself. The goal is not to avoid pain, but to transform it. And transformation begins only when we ask the brave question, what is this moment asking me to learn? This question requires humility, for it forces us to admit that suffering can be a teacher greater than comfort. It requires patience, because meaning is not always revealed instantly. Sometimes we must sit with the wound for a long time before we glimpse the lesson hidden within. And it requires faith, a trust that even the most unbearable moments can, in time, be integrated into the fabric of our becoming. There is a quiet nobility in those who have suffered deeply yet speak of their lives with gratitude. They are not people who have avoided pain, but people who have given it meaning. They carry their scars not with shame, but with reverence, for they know those scars are proof of transformation. They no longer ask, why did this happen to me? But instead, what has this made of me? That shift is the essence of redemption. And so we must remember, escape is the path of repetition, but meaning is the path of transformation. Every time we run from pain, we invite it to return, wearing a new face, knocking again at the door of our consciousness. But when we sit with it, when we listen, when we seek its hidden wisdom, it need not return. Its purpose fulfilled, it dissolves, leaving in its place not despair but depth, not weakness but strength, not bitterness but compassion. The cycles of emotional pain that haunt us are not broken by avoidance, nor by denial, nor by pretending to be unaffected. They are broken when we find meaning within them, when we weave the thread of suffering into the tapestry of our becoming. Then what once haunted us becomes part of our story of growth, and we discover that the very thing we feared most has become the foundation of our wisdom, our courage, and our capacity to love. Love is the final truth, the ultimate key that releases us from the endless repetitions of suffering. For as long as we live without it, without its presence in our own hearts, we find ourselves circling the same patterns, bound to the same invisible chains. Love for others is noble and necessary, but without love for ourselves, it cannot take root in a way that transforms. Without self-love, we unconsciously invite what harms us. We tolerate disrespect, we settle for half measures, we excuse mistreatment, all because we have not yet believed that we are worthy of something better. The cycle of pain endures, not because the world is merciless, but because we have not yet offered mercy to ourselves. It is not an easy truth to accept, for many of us have been conditioned to think of self-love as selfishness, as vanity, as weakness. We are taught to give endlessly, to sacrifice, to endure, and while giving has its beauty, the absence of self-love turns it into a distortion. A person who does not love themselves gives not out of abundance, but out of hunger. They give because they are secretly begging for return, for scraps of validation, for proof that they matter. But such giving rarely brings what is longed for. Instead, it perpetuates emptiness. It binds the giver to relationships where they are unseen, unvalued, or taken advantage of. The absence of self-love ensures the repetition of suffering, for until we see our worth, we continue to walk into places where it is denied. I once knew a man who had spent his entire life chasing the love of his father. That father, cold and withholding, never offered him approval. The boy grew into a man still carrying the ache of that absence. He sought recognition in his work, in his friendships, in his romances. But no matter what he achieved, no matter how hard he tried, the void within remained. For decades he lived in that cycle, moving from one disappointment to the next, unconsciously repeating the original wound. Then, slowly, he began to turn inward. Instead of waiting for his father to speak words that would never come, he began to speak them to himself. He told himself that he was proud of who he had become. He told himself that his efforts were enough, that his presence in the world mattered. He gave to himself what he had been denied. It was not easy at first, for the voices of the past still echoed, but each time he chose compassion, the echoes grew weaker. And one day he realized he was no longer living in pursuit of his father's shadow. The cycle had ended, not because the father had changed, but because the son had chosen love for himself. This is the nature of love. It is the great dissolver of cycles. It softens what has been hardened by years of neglect. It heals the child within us who still waits at the door of someone's approval. It tells that child, you no longer need to suffer for love already lives in you. When this truth is embraced, the compulsions that drive us toward repetition lose their power. We no longer seek pain disguised as affection. We no longer confuse control with intimacy. We no longer mistake silence for peace. We begin to choose differently, not because the world has changed, but because we have. And love, once kindled within, does not remain small. It grows outward, touching everything around us. To love oneself is not to become isolated or selfish. It is to become whole enough to love others without fear, without need, without grasping. For love that begins in the self becomes the fountain from which compassion flows. It makes forgiveness possible, not as an obligation, but as a natural extension of the heart. It creates boundaries, not as walls to shut others out, but as the healthy recognition that true connection cannot thrive in a soil poisoned by disrespect. Imagine a woman who has always settled for less, always remained in relationships where she was diminished. Each time she told herself it was better than being alone. Each time she believed that perhaps if she gave more, she might finally receive. And yet, each time the story ended in the same heartbreak. This is the cycle at work, the wheel turning endlessly. But one day she looks at herself not with criticism, not with impatience, but with tenderness. She says, "I deserve to be cherished. I deserve to be seen." She begins to live as if that were true, and suddenly the old cycle no longer draws her in. She no longer accepts what wounds her. She no longer confuses pain with passion. She has ended the cycle not through force, but through love. Love, then, is not a sentiment or a fleeting emotion. It is a power, a force that reorients the psyche. It is the foundation of wholeness. Where there is self-love, there is no compulsion to repeat old wounds. Where there is self-love, there is freedom from the ghosts of the past. Where there is self-love, there is the courage to step into new patterns, new possibilities, new life. And this is why the cycle of emotional pain, which may torment us for years or even decades, can dissolve in a single moment of true love. It is the moment when we no longer betray ourselves, when we no longer speak to ourselves with cruelty, when we no longer abandon ourselves for the sake of pleasing others. It is the moment when we choose to return home to ourselves, to embrace the one person we can never leave behind. The wheel of suffering turns until love stops it, and when it stops, we discover that life, which once seemed only a pattern of repetition, is in fact a journey toward wholeness. The wounds we carried become teachers. The scars we bear become reminders of our strength, and the love we offer to ourselves becomes the ground from which all other love can grow. Thus the final truth stands. Love is the force that ends the cycle. It is the healing, the liberation, the transformation we have sought all along, and when we embrace it, not as an abstract idea, but as a daily practice, a way of speaking to ourselves, a way of honoring who we are, we discover that life does not have to repeat its pain. Life can move forward, and so can we, into freedom, into fullness, into wholeness. So, my friends, the spiritual principle that breaks the cycle of emotional pain is this: we must face our wounds, learn their lessons, take responsibility, find their meaning, and above all, respond with love. When we do, pain no longer rules us. The wheel of suffering stops, and in its place arises a life not defined by old patterns, but open to new horizons, free, whole, and deeply alive.